Ukraine's counteroffensive. Ukraine's counteroffensive strategy brilliantly employs the ancient art of dilemma creation, forcing adversaries to pick between two dire outcomes. Rather than attacking Russia's primary strength, they target secondary units, a fundamental part of defensive structures often overlooked. Making these operations public, yet also advocating for social media silence, Ukraine presents Russia with a tactical nightmare. If Russia fortifies these secondary units, their main front becomes exposed. Conversely, bolstering the main line makes secondary units vulnerable. This strategy thrusts Russia into a precarious decision-making bind, maximizing Ukraine's advantage and potentially inflicting a devastating blow on Russian forces. Secondary units play pivotal roles in defense, providing depth and flexibility. By targeting these, Ukraine threatens the overall integrity of Russia's defense. The strategic publicizing, juxtaposed with social media restraint, is ingenious. It challenges Russia's narrative while guarding operational security, further deepening Russia's quandary. For the Kremlin, this is a nightmare, a catch-22 scenario with no favorable outcome. Ukraine's understanding of defense intricacies, combined with public perception management, gives them a significant edge in this ongoing conflict. Now, info warriors, drop your witty comments and memes below. If you're tracking the Russia-Ukraine situation, show some support with a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Word has it every subscriber gives Putin's mustache an extra twitch. Let's dive deeper. The role of secondary units. Secondary units in defense strategy serve as the mobile backbone, adjusting to the opponent's attack vector. Their role complements the frontline soldiers, whose main goal is to even out vulnerabilities and deter breakthroughs. Simply put, frontline soldiers are the steadfast barrier, while secondary units offer dynamic support where needed. When allocating troops, defenders face a pivotal choice: distribute soldiers along the front, or reserve more for the mobile secondary units. If Russia deploys troops only on the front, Ukraine can exploit vulnerabilities by concentrating their forces at weaker points. Conversely, if Russia spreads thinly, Ukrainian forces could outnumber them everywhere, capitalizing on their natural numerical advantage. The defender's strategy should ideally strike a balance. Frontline soldiers hold positions, stalling attackers and buying time. Their objective is not immediate victory, but to delay until secondary units arrive and reinforce, leveling the playing field. When numbers are roughly equal, the defender usually has the upper hand due to terrain familiarity and defensive cover. However, there's a delicate balance to maintain. Overcommitting on the front risks diminishing the mobility and response capability of secondary units. On the other hand, neglecting frontline allocations might result in quick breakthroughs by the attackers. Optimal defense considers reinforcement times, adjusting frontline thickness accordingly and strategically positioning secondary units for rapid deployment. In essence, while the temptation might be to bolster mobile units, a well-balanced defense combines both static strength and dynamic adaptability. Ukraine's shaping operations. Ukraine's shaping operations were tactical maneuvers aimed at setting the stage for a more significant offensive. Key strategies include urban combat in Bakhmut. By holding ground in Bakhmut, Ukraine drew Russia into demanding urban warfare, causing substantial casualties and draining resources. Although eventually retreating, this tactic generated internal discord within Russian leadership, weakening their strategic unity. Peripheral pressures. Even post-Bakhmut's loss, Ukraine's forces applied consistent pressure on its outskirts. This strategy forced Russian troops to commit further to the region while pushing out non-regular forces like Wagner mercenaries. Cross-border partisan attacks. Notably, in the Belgorod region, Ukrainian-backed partisan forces carried out incursions. Starting from the west of Kharkiv, then pausing and resuming from its east, these attacks signaled Ukraine's ability to cause disturbances deep within Russian territory. Drones over Kremlin and Moscow strikes. Mystery drones appearing over the Kremlin and subsequent attacks in Moscow's elite suburbs added to the psychological warfare. Western intelligence hints at Ukraine's backing, further demonstrating their capability to touch Russia's heartland. Targeting infrastructure. Through artillery fire and precision missiles like Storm Shadow, Ukraine disrupted critical Russian roads, ports, and infrastructure. This tactic aimed to cut supplies, weaken response times, and further deteriorate Russian morale. These maneuvers were designed to preempt Ukraine's major counteroffensive. By using a mix of urban warfare, guerrilla attacks, and infrastructure disruptions, Ukraine hoped to fracture Russian defenses, sow doubt, and create an advantageous platform for their forthcoming offensive. Secrecy and operational security. What is interesting about Ukraine's shaping operations is the deliberate balance between public visibility and operational security. While the government has been cautious about officially acknowledging authorization and responsibility for these activities, Ukraine has been quite open about the events themselves. Simultaneously, there has been a strong emphasis on operational security, with a request for social media to refrain from reporting on the movement of Ukrainian soldiers. These seemingly contradictory approaches serve a purpose in exploiting the political constraints and creating a dilemma for the Kremlin. The dilemma arises from Russia's shortage of available personnel. While the Kremlin is aware of the situation and the activities taking place, it struggles to provide satisfactory answers or responses. Without resorting to a full-scale mobilization, Russia finds itself limited in its options to counter Ukraine's shaping operations effectively. The precise nature of the dilemma is not explicitly mentioned, but it likely revolves around the challenge of allocating resources, determining the appropriate response, and mitigating the impact of Ukraine's strategic moves. By leveraging the public visibility of its operations, Ukraine puts pressure on Russia, forcing the Kremlin to confront the dilemma of how to address these developments within its own constraints and limitations. Russia's dilemma. Russia finds itself in a predicament due to strained resources, expanding front lines and increased internal security needs, thanks to drone threats, have spread Russian troops thin. With the persistent challenges in Belgorod and Moscow, Russia can't neglect these fronts, but addressing them demands more manpower. The conundrum: how to source more troops when stretched thin? Failing to bolster the front risks an immediate Ukrainian breakthrough, making Russia's secondary units redundant. Russia's solution is to reduce secondary forces, reallocating what remains, creating a tense dynamic on the battlefield. Ukraine, tactically, keeps its offensive target secret, ensuring Russia's secondary forces can't prep in advance. The success of Ukraine's silence campaign is paramount here. Their initial counterattack appears widespread, essentially feeling for weak spots without showing their hand. This tactic pins down Russia's secondary forces, restricting their response time. Should Ukraine pierce the front before secondary forces can reinforce, Russia's in a bind. Secondary units are most potent when fortified, but a breach forces them into exposed combat or retreat. Ukraine can then flank, compromising other Russian defenses, reminiscent of their 2022 move east of Kharkiv. The real game is how quickly Ukraine can push before Russia regroups, echoing the 2023 Azov sprint to the sea. The delayed spring counteroffensive was strategic. While Ukrainian troops underwent Western training, ground conditions needed to be dry, ensuring unhindered mobility. Dry conditions benefit both sides, but if Russia's mobility falters due to issues like maintenance or supply line attacks, Ukraine could exploit the summer offensive to its advantage. Russia's unattractive alternatives. Russia faces a challenging dilemma in finding a solution to its problem. The obvious option is to mobilize additional troops, as it did following Ukraine's counteroffensive in September 2022. However, this comes with risks and potential public backlash, as Putin aimed to avoid disrupting the average Russian citizen's everyday life during his pre-invasion appeal. The tolerance of Russian citizens may be strained with another mobilization, making it a less attractive alternative for the Kremlin. The problem for Putin is that mobilizing earlier would have been more effective in preventing Ukraine from reaching the Sea of Azov. If Ukraine successfully reaches this objective, Russian troops would be divided, making it more challenging to halt the Ukrainian advance. However, the time to institute a preventive mobilization has passed, and it remains to be seen whether Russia can hold on to its front lines long enough for secondary forces to arrive. The outcome will determine the extent of Ukraine's counteroffensive. There is uncertainty regarding whether the Russian nightmare scenario will materialize, as Russia and Ukraine have differing assessments of each side's ability to win the war. Nevertheless, the possibility of such an outcome is a concern for the Kremlin. Alternatively, Russia could accept a temporary check and choose a proactive retreat strategy, similar to what was done in Kherson back in November 2022. This approach aims to preserve Russian soldiers with the hope of fighting under more favorable circumstances in the future. However, this option is also unattractive, as it could lead to summer successes for Ukraine's counterattack, further engaging Western partners and raising public expectations for continued military aid, undermining Russia's plan to fight under better conditions later on.